All right. Now, let's hear from Alex. Alex, share your vision and views about the untapped economic growth opportunities offered by the continent's media and entertainment industry and the role it could play as a potential driver for job creation and economic development in Africa.
Thank you. Alex Okosi, I run our Viacom business in Africa. And it's interesting because I do believe that the future of the continent does rest in the small businesses that effectively employ and can create jobs for a large sector, not only of our population, but more importantly, the young population that right now oftentimes don't have access to great jobs, right? So this issue of what can government do and what can the banks do to be able to spur the growth of these companies and make them bigger is a critical one that we should really, really explore and brainstorm in terms of what's the best ways to be able to do it, at least to spur it, because infrastructure is obviously really key from a development bank perspective to make sure that we have it in place. But really, the mass amount of jobs to be created are going to come from these industries. So it's important that we look at how do we make sure that we put together with government frameworks for being able to, A, protect the banks that may be interested in lending to SMEs. For instance, I do believe that government should have initiatives that require banks to learn a certain percentage of their portfolio, at least their loans, to SMEs. Now, that may sound a little controversial from a standpoint of banks who, of course, are oftentimes nervous about the collateral that the SMEs have to offer. But I do think that in that instance, you do force the banks to enable the SMEs by providing at least a framework to what they need to be able to meet, to be able to access those loans. Without doing that, you're going to have funding that never really gets to the SMEs. And again, this growth that we're talking about spurring will never happen. So I think it's a practical thing that government can do in that instance to be able to do this. From a development bank perspective, it's again being able to work with government and from a best practice perspective to help educate them on how we can create frameworks for protecting also the SME in terms of what they're able to create. In the space that I'm working, for instance, in terms of media, IP is an issue, right? So if I'm a bank and I'm supposed to potentially lend to a small media company, how do I ensure that what they create will be protected at the end of the day? How do I ensure that they won't be pirated at the end of the day? How do I make sure that government, if they are being pirated, is going to have rules in place and enforceable laws in place to be able to curb it? Because if I'm a bank and I am looking at investing in an SME, it's going to be quite critical for me to know that the business model that they created is sustainable and that they can actually execute it. And they cannot do it if, again, there is no framework from a regulatory perspective and enforceable laws from a government perspective that effectively means that the return on that investment will happen because those companies become viable and bigger. So I think it's critical that government plays a role in being able to understand that it needs to put these regulatory frameworks in place. The development banks need to play a role in being able to also help, create funds that the SMEs can tap into. But in the process of tapping into these funds, they're able to actually put in place a way of being able to evaluate the viability of these SMEs. And those that do look good, the business plans that do look, the operations that look good, that can be scaled, are now supported in that process. But for us to, we can get into a theoretical conversation about what needs to be done. But I think that government needs to take practical steps. I think a lot of banks probably not going to like the idea that they may be required to, commit a certain amount of their lending portfolio to SMEs. But I think there's no other way to really spur the sort of growth that we want Africa to have, recognizing that a large portion of African businesses, quote unquote, are in the informal sector. But effectively what that means is that they're SMEs.
All right, thank you, Alex. Fantastic, Alex likes controversy. But Alex, if you can go out the door after, that's your problem. I won't be. There are some bankers in the room, be careful. But joke aside, I won't get into, obviously, the debate, but I believe the market should be able to tell you. If you look at some banks, I mean, Equity Bank is there. They have had a model where they started going a lot to SMEs themselves, but it wasn't because the government imposed it on them. And frankly, if you can make money, you will do it. And but anyway, it's a rather long conversation. There are other things. You are talking about infrastructure. I mean, how can you be profitable? How can you industrialize a country if, you know, the SME has to buy electricity at 30 cents a kilowatt or 40 cents a kilowatt or 25? But so a number of issues to put together. Obviously, we're talking primarily about financing, but I think we should keep all of this in mind.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.